the trend that overshadowed everything else in Munich this year was the further chasm developing in the EU-US relationship. Um, we knew that there was already a lot of pressure on Europe to spend more in defense. There was a sort of messy divorce between the Trump administration and the EU, and that was very much confirmed by Marco Rubio's speech, which was the highlight or the low light of the weekend, depending on how you look at it.
Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe. For the United States and Europe, we belong together.
He hit many of the same messages as Vice President J.D. Vance a year earlier, albeit with a more polite, slightly more diplomatic tone, but the underlying MAGA nationalistic message was really the same. The takeaway is that the US still wants to work with Europe, but only if it embraces a form of Trumpism. Elsewhere, China was working the margins. It was not front and center, but there was definitely a sense that Beijing is trying to capitalize on this separation of Western powers. Wang Yi, the foreign minister's speech, pitched Beijing as a stable and predictable force in a world of chaos. That's not new. I mean, that's basically every speech that Wang Yi gives. What's different is that it now all of a sudden looks more reasonable when it's placed next to the rhetoric that you're hearing from the Americans, even if many of the Europeans that I spoke to also had reservations about the accuracy or the validity of what Wang was claiming. I'd say there was two different sorts of reaction. One was the public reaction, and one was the private reaction. The sight of EU leaders and ministers giving Marco Rubio a standing ovation after being told that they are pursuing civilizational erasure was shocking for many. I mean, it's come in for a lot of criticism. In private, it was slightly different. There was a tacit understanding that this is not a good moment. That while they welcomed the certain commitments that the US delegation gave to partnering with the EU and to NATO and to defending NATO's Article 5, in general, there was a private admission that this is terrible, that this is dressing things up slightly more diplomatically than a year before, but the message is brutal. And I think for Europe, you've started to hear over the last year, and I heard this a lot in Munich as well, there's a recognition now that they not only have to de-risk from China, but also from the United States, which is something a couple of years ago that nobody was saying. Publicly, on the third day of the conference, we did start to see some pushback against Rubio. The EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, for one, went to do her speech and really pushed back against this idea of civilizational erasure.
Contrary to what some may say, woke, decadent Europe is not facing civilizational erasure. In fact, people still want to join our club, and not just fellow Europeans. When I was in Canada last year, I was told that over 40% of Canadians have an interest in joining the European Union.
Don't forget that the US has not yet revoked its security blanket for Europe. So I don't think that they see too much value in publicly pushing back too strongly against Rubio. If they started booing the US Secretary of State, which perhaps some of them felt like doing deep down, maybe that would have been a feel-good moment, but strategically perhaps not the most clever way of dealing with this if you're still trying to keep the Americans engaged. Yeah, I've been going to Munich for a few years now. A few years ago, China was very much pitched as a threat. It was very high up on the agenda of things that were being discussed. It was not so much this year, and you could tell when I spoke with Chinese analysts and former officials and diplomats, etc., there was much more a sense of being relaxed and being confident. Now, if you watch a lot of Wang Yi speeches, as some of us have to do, you will see that the message doesn't really change that much from year to year. It always pitches China as the guardian of the multilateral order, champions of the United Nations. This is not new, but again, when you put that sort of rhetoric next to the sort of UN thrashing rhetoric that you hear from the Americans these days, all of a sudden it sounds a bit more reasonable. There is absolutely an opening for China to improve ties with those countries that America has scorned. One thing that did concern some of the countries and delegates that I was speaking to was the very, very hardline Chinese rhetoric on Japan. That was the one thing that was really different between last year's speech and this year's speech. As you know, this is a situation that has been rumbling on and simmering away. Some of the sources that I was speaking to over the course of the weekend and subsequent to the weekend were concerned about the direction of that situation.